Lady Evelyn Carrington lived her life in quiet opulence, far from the bustling city. Carrington Manor stood proudly amidst the rolling hills, its towering spires casting long shadows over the manicured gardens below. The walls of the grand estate were steeped in history, adorned with portraits of ancestors who watched over the family for generations. Inside, the rooms felt like relics of a bygone era, preserved with meticulous care by the small but loyal staff that Evelyn had known for years. At 58, Evelyn's days followed a predictable routine. She spent her mornings reading in her late husband's study, a room filled with old books and documents that carried the weight of memories. Though she cherished the calm, it sometimes felt like a heavy silence settled over the manor. Mr. Hammond, the butler, was her most trusted companion. He had served the Carrington family for over 2 decades, a man of quiet precision and diligence. Despite her comfortable life, Evelyn couldn't help but feel the undercurrent of isolation. After her husband passed, the estate felt emptier, even with the staff going about their duties. The halls were quieter, the moments alone longer. Sometimes, she caught herself thinking about the secrets her husband might have kept in his final years, small things left unsaid. But those thoughts never lingered too long. The house ran smoothly under Mr. Hammond's care. Everything was in its proper place, and Evelyn hardly had to worry about the day-to-day operations. His reliability brought her comfort. Yet, there were moments, fleeting but noticeable, when she would catch his gaze lingering too long or find him moving about the manor in the early hours of the morning, quietly attending to tasks when no one else was awake. But nothing seemed amiss, at least not at first glance. The peace of her life at Carrington Manor was not something she took for granted. As she closed her book that morning and looked out the window, watching Mr. Hammond speak quietly with Anna, the housemaid, she felt a pang of gratitude. Everything was in order. At least, that's what she thought. Evelyn had always cherished her late husband's study, but today, something felt different. The light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the room, illuminating the dust that seemed to hang suspended in the air. She had entered with the simple intention of tidying up the shelves, a task she often undertook to keep herself busy. But as her fingers grazed across the old volumes, she felt something odd behind one of the bookcases. Puzzled, she stepped back and examined the shelf more closely. There, barely noticeable, was a small compartment hidden within the woodwork. Curiosity overtook her as she pried it open with a soft creak. Inside lay a strange device, an object that looked distinctly out of place amidst the centuries-old books and antique furniture. It was a camera. Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't installed this. Had her husband? The thought chilled her. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, the weight of it heavier than expected. Who would need to spy in this house? What had it been capturing? With growing unease, she connected the camera to her old computer in the corner of the room, unsure of what she would find. As the footage loaded, the stillness of the study felt oppressive, almost suffocating. For a moment, she considered abandoning the task altogether, but something within her, a deep, unsettling curiosity, kept her rooted in place. The footage began, showing simple, unremarkable images of the room. Hours of nothing but an empty study. But then, as the night deepened, a figure appeared. Mr. Hammond. Evelyn's brow furrowed as she watched him move through the room. At first, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. He was simply cleaning, performing his duties. But then, he did something strange. He opened a drawer in her husband's desk and began sifting through papers. It was subtle, his actions smooth and practiced, but unmistakable. He was searching for something. Her heart raced as she watched, unable to tear her eyes away. He looked over his shoulder cautiously, as if aware that someone could be watching, though he had no reason to suspect anyone was. After a few minutes, he quietly slipped out of the room, leaving everything as it had been. Evelyn stared at the screen, frozen in disbelief. The man she had trusted implicitly, who had been at her side for decades, was sneaking around her home, going through personal belongings that were not his to touch. The room felt colder now, as if the shadows had deepened. What else had she missed? Evelyn couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen. The figure of Mr. Hammond, moving so stealthily, so deliberately, felt like a betrayal she couldn't process. The man she had relied on, the man who had practically run her household, was now a stranger to her. She rewatched the footage over and over, hoping to find some innocent explanation for his actions, but the truth was plain. He had gone through her husband's things that should have remained untouched after his death. As the hours passed, Evelyn's mind raced. Why would Mr. Hammond do this? What could he possibly be looking for? And how long had this been going on without her knowing? Every creak of the old house suddenly felt ominous, every shadow suspect. She began to think back to all the moments she had dismissed over the years, those late-night movements, the hushed conversations between the staff when they thought she wasn't listening. The footage played on, but the more she watched, the more paranoid she became. Was he only going through her husband's study, or had he been invading other areas of the house as well? The thought chilled her. If he had access to her personal spaces, her bedroom, her letters, what else could he have uncovered? That night, Evelyn barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Hammond's hands rifling through her belongings, his calm demeanor hiding something much more sinister. Her mind buzzed with questions. Should she confront him directly? Should she wait and gather more evidence? Or was she overreacting? The man had been part of her life for decades. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The next morning, she tried to act normal, going about her daily routine with a forced calmness. She watched Mr. Hammond more closely now, his every movement under her scrutiny. When he brought her tea, she thanked him as she always did, but her voice felt stiff, unnatural. Could he sense her unease? Did he know that she had discovered his secret? She couldn't risk tipping her hand too early. If Mr. Hammond was hiding something, she needed to find out what it was before confronting him. The tension in the air was palpable, and Evelyn felt trapped in her own home, suffocated by the weight of her suspicions. That afternoon, she made the decision. She would not confront Mr. Hammond, not yet. First, she needed to know how deep this went. There had to be more clues, more signs of his betrayal hidden throughout the manor. And if Mr. Hammond was as careful as he seemed, he might be watching her just as closely. She needed to be cautious. But no matter how much she tried to rationalize, one thing was clear. Her trust in Mr. Hammond had been shattered, and she could never look at him the same way again. Days passed, and Evelyn's paranoia grew. Each interaction with Mr. Hammond was strained, the knowledge of his betrayal like a heavy cloud hanging over her. She tried to go about her usual routine, but every time she saw him, her mind replayed the footage of him rifling through her husband's desk. His presence, once a source of comfort, now felt threatening. Evelyn knew she had to act, but the question of how lingered in her mind. If she confronted him, would he admit to his actions, or would he lie, as easily as he seemed to have done all these years? And what if he denied everything? She had no one to confide in, no one to trust. Even Anna, the housemaid, seemed distant now. Could Mr. Hammond have involved her too? The very thought made Evelyn shudder. One afternoon, as she sat in the drawing room with her cup of tea, Evelyn's mind wandered to darker places. If Mr. Hammond had been spying on her, had he shared this information with others? Could there be more people involved in this betrayal? It seemed impossible to believe, yet the evidence was undeniable. She had to know how deep this treachery went. Taking a deep breath, she began her own investigation. While the staff were busy with their tasks, she quietly slipped into different rooms, checking for more hidden cameras or signs of tampering. The paranoia gnawed at her as she searched, but there was nothing concrete, just a nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. As she made her way to her own bedroom, the place where she felt most vulnerable, her heart raced. Had Mr. Hammond been in here too? Had he violated her most personal space? With trembling hands, she checked her bedside table, the drawers where she kept letters from her late husband, and the locked box under her bed. Nothing appeared to be disturbed, but the thought that someone could have been in there, touching her belongings, sent a wave of nausea through her. Her suspicions began to seep into every interaction. She noticed how Mr. Hammond moved through the house, his measured steps, his quiet efficiency. Was he always so cautious, or was he hiding something? His politeness, once endearing, now felt like a mask, a well-practiced facade that concealed darker intentions. Evelyn's isolation deepened. The manor, once her sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The grandeur of Carrington Manor, with its expansive halls and towering rooms, only emphasized how alone she truly was. The very walls that had once protected her seemed to close in, trapping her in a web of doubt and fear. As the days dragged on, Evelyn's mind swirled with possibilities. Could it be that Mr. Hammond had been spying on her since her husband's death? Or had this started long before? She couldn't shake the feeling that this went deeper than just one man's betrayal. But every time she considered confronting him, the weight of her suspicions pulled her back. What if she was wrong? What if this was all in her head? But no matter how much she doubted herself, one truth remained. She could no longer trust the people around her. Her once peaceful life had been shattered, and the weight of that betrayal was heavier than she ever could have imagined. Evelyn could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling of unease. Each passing day intensified her need for answers, and she knew she had to act. The secret Mr. Hammond was hiding felt bigger than a single breach of trust. Evelyn was certain there was more beneath the surface, something deeper, more sinister. Early one morning, when the house was still, Evelyn began her quiet search. Mr. Hammond was preoccupied with his routine tasks in the garden, giving her the opportunity to slip unnoticed into areas he frequented when she wasn't around. She started with his quarters, a small, well-kept room at the far end of the manor, near the kitchen. The modest space was perfectly organized, much like the man himself. There was nothing outwardly suspicious. The bed was neatly made, the desk free of clutter, and the wardrobe held nothing more than a few sets of his well-pressed uniforms. But as Evelyn's eyes swept the room, she noticed a loose floorboard near the bed. Her pulse quickened as she knelt down, prying the board loose with trembling hands. Beneath it, she found a small box. Inside, there were documents, letters, notes, and photographs. As she sifted through them, her heart sank. The letters were addressed to Mr. Hammond, but they spoke of the Carrington estate as if it were part of a larger plan. There were references to people she didn't recognize, and one note in particular caught her eye: secure all documents related to Lord Carrington's holdings. Evelyn's hands shook as she read it. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. Mr. Hammond was involved in something far more calculated, something that involved her late husband's wealth, and perhaps even the future of the estate itself. Footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Evelyn quickly replaced the floorboard, returning everything to its place. Her mind raced as she hurried back to her own quarters, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Mr. Hammond had been plotting against her for years, and she had been completely blind to it. The very man who had managed her home so diligently had also been quietly undermining her. But the documents raised more questions than they answered. Who were the people mentioned in the letters? And what exactly were they after? The estate, her husband's fortune, or something more? Evelyn's suspicions were no longer contained to Mr. Hammond alone. If he was involved in this plot, who else in her life could be part of it? The staff, old family friends? She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted, and everything she once relied on had become unstable. She needed more evidence. She couldn't confront Mr. Hammond without fully understanding the scope of his plan. And if she was going to protect herself and this state, she had to be smart, quiet, calculated, just like him. Evelyn spent the next few days in a state of constant vigilance. Every interaction with Mr. Hammond felt like a battle of wits. She watched his movements, noted his routines, and listened carefully to his conversations with the rest of the staff. He was always so composed, so controlled, that it was impossible to catch him off guard. But Evelyn had learned something from her discovery in his quarters. Mr. Hammond wasn't infallible. He had made mistakes, small ones, but enough to raise her suspicions. And now, it was her turn to play the game. She knew that to truly expose Mr. Hammond, she needed to set a trap, one that would force him to reveal his intentions. It had to be subtle, something that wouldn't make him suspicious, but would draw him out into the open. Evelyn carefully crafted her plan. She decided to plant false information in her bedroom, documents that appeared to be of great importance. They were old estate records, nothing of real value, but to someone like Mr. Hammond, they might seem like the key to uncovering more of Lord Carrington's hidden holdings. She left the documents in plain sight on her desk, as if they had been carelessly left out. Then, she waited. Each day, she kept a careful eye on Mr. Hammond, her nerves taut as a wire. She could see no sign that he had taken the bait. He continued his duties with the same quiet efficiency as always. But Evelyn had learned not to be fooled by his calm exterior. Late one night, when the house was still and the staff had retired to their quarters, Evelyn sat in her darkened room, watching the door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she waited, wondering if her plan would work. And then, just as she was about to give up, she heard the soft click of her bedroom door opening. She held her breath, watching from the shadows as Mr. Hammond slipped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He went straight to her desk, his eyes scanning the papers she had left out. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might leave without taking anything, but then his hand moved to the documents. He flipped through them carefully before tucking one into his jacket pocket. Evelyn's heart raced as she watched him leave the room, closing the door behind him as silently as he had entered. Her plan had worked. The next morning, she awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. Now that she had concrete evidence of Mr. Hammond's actions, she could take the next step in her investigation. But she still didn't know the full scope of his plot or how many others might be involved. She couldn't go to the authorities without more information. If this conspiracy was as large as she feared, exposing it too early could put her in even greater danger. For now, she would play the part of the oblivious widow, going about her daily routine as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, she was already 2 steps ahead, planning her next move. Mr. Hammond might think he had the upper hand, but Evelyn was no longer the naive woman he had once deceived. The game had changed, and she was determined to win. Evelyn had spent countless days perfecting her facade of ignorance, and now she felt it paying off. Her mind was sharp, and her movements careful, but beneath the surface, she seethed with determination. Mr. Hammond's calm demeanor remained unchanged, but Evelyn knew better now. She had witnessed his deception firsthand, and with every passing day, she grew more confident in her ability to expose him. One afternoon, she summoned Anna, the housemaid, to her sitting room under the pretense of discussing household duties. Anna had been with the Carringtons for years, much like Mr. Hammond, but unlike the butler, she had always been deferential and nervous in Evelyn's presence. The young woman's anxiety now, however, seemed different. As they spoke, Evelyn noticed how Anna avoided eye contact, her hands twisting the apron she wore. It was a subtle shift, but it made Evelyn wonder if Anna had seen more than she let on. Perhaps Mr. Hammond hadn't kept all his secrets hidden from her. Deciding to test the waters, Evelyn gently broached the subject. "Anna," she began, her voice soft, "I've been noticing some strange things lately. Around the house, with Mr. Hammond." Anna's hands froze, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric in her lap. Evelyn's heart raced at the reaction. She was onto something. The maid looked up, her face pale. "Strange things, milady?" "Yes," Evelyn replied, leaning forward slightly, keeping her tone casual. "I can't help but wonder if I've missed something. You've worked closely with Mr. Hammond. Has anything seemed off to you?" For a moment, Anna hesitated, her eyes darting toward the door as if afraid Mr. Hammond might walk in at any moment. Then, her voice dropped to a whisper. "Milady, I've seen things. Things I thought didn't concern me. But now—" "Tell me, Anna," Evelyn pressed gently. "It's important." Anna took a deep breath, glancing around nervously before continuing. "At night, sometimes I've seen Mr. Hammond in places he shouldn't be, places he has no reason to go. The library, your husband's study. And I've heard him talking to someone late at night, but I've never seen who it is." Evelyn's chest tightened. So it wasn't just her imagination. Mr. Hammond had been moving about the house in ways that went far beyond his duties. And talking to someone? Could there be more people involved in this plot? "Did you hear what he was saying?" Evelyn asked, her voice low. Anna shook her head. I could never make out the words, just the sound of his voice. But milady, I didn't want to say anything before, because I didn't think it was my place. And Mr. Hammond, he's always been kind to me. Evelyn nodded, understanding the fear that must have gripped the young woman. Mr. Hammond had been a figure of authority in the house for so long, and his influence was undeniable. But now, it was clear that his reach went far beyond what anyone had imagined. You did the right thing by telling me, Anna, Evelyn said, her voice firm. But you mustn't let him know that we've spoken about this. I'll take care of it. Anna nodded, relief evident on her face, but the tension between them remained thick. As the maid left the room, Evelyn sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Mr. Hammond wasn't just rifling through papers or snooping for personal information. He was communicating with someone. But who? And what was the endgame? The revelation left her feeling both validated and more vulnerable than ever. She wasn't just fighting a battle of wills against Mr. Hammond. There was a larger conspiracy at play, one that likely involved people outside the estate. If Mr. Hammond had an accomplice, or worse, a network of people working with him, Evelyn's life could be in even greater danger than she realized. But now, she wasn't alone. Anna had seen the cracks in Mr. Hammond's perfect facade, and together, they could uncover the truth. It was time to dig deeper. Evelyn's mind was racing, but she knew she had to remain calm. She couldn't afford any mistakes, not with the stakes so high. With Anna's help, she could finally begin to piece together the puzzle, but it wasn't enough to know that Mr. Hammond was acting suspiciously. She needed to understand why. That night, Evelyn took a bold step. She crept into her late husband's study once more, determined to search for additional clues. If Mr. Hammond had been looking for something, there had to be a reason. She had to find out what it was before he did. The study was dark, illuminated only by the moonlight filtering through the tall windows. Evelyn moved quietly, her heart pounding as she rifled through the drawers of the large mahogany desk. There were financial records, estate documents, and old letters from her husband's business associates, but nothing immediately stood out. Then, at the bottom of one of the drawers, she found a folder she hadn't noticed before. It was marked with her husband's initials, a small detail that immediately caught her attention. As she opened it, her breath caught. Inside were detailed records of Lord Carrington's holdings, investments, properties, and assets that Evelyn hadn't known about. But that wasn't all. There were references to offshore accounts, hidden from the estate's official records, and notes about dealings with certain influential figures, people Evelyn had only heard of in passing. Her husband had kept these secrets from her, and it seemed Mr. Hammond had known about them. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read through the papers. These were the documents Mr. Hammond had been searching for, the ones he had been so desperate to find. But why? What was his connection to all of this? As she sifted through the records, Evelyn found something even more disturbing. One of the letters, written in a code she barely recognized, was signed not by her husband, but by someone named H. The realization struck her like a physical blow. Mr. Hammond. It had to be. He wasn't just a servant. He had been involved in her husband's dealings from the very beginning. The pieces were falling into place. Mr. Hammond had likely been acting on behalf of someone else, or perhaps even orchestrating this scheme himself. He had positioned himself within this state, gaining Evelyn's trust, all while working towards some greater goal, one that involved her husband's wealth and power. Evelyn's mind raced as she considered the implications. Who else was involved? And how deep did this conspiracy go? Was she being watched even now? Her every move calculated by forces beyond her understanding? The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She couldn't trust anyone, not even the people she had known for years. Mr. Hammond had woven a web of lies and deceit so intricate that it had taken her this long to even notice. But now that she knew the truth, she had to act. Time was running out. If Mr. Hammond realized she had uncovered a secret, there was no telling what he might do. Evelyn carefully replaced the documents in the drawer, her hands shaking as she closed the folder. She couldn't confront him yet, not until she had more information. But she knew one thing for certain. The man she had trusted for decades had been playing her for a fool, and the stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. As she left the study, and made her way back to her room, Evelyn's resolve hardened. She would expose Mr. Hammond and his accomplices, no matter what it took. The future of the Carrington estate and her own life depended on it. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. Each revelation about Mr. Hammond had pulled her deeper into a web of deception that stretched far beyond her estate. She knew she needed help, but who could she trust? Detective Hawkins was the only person who came to mind. A retired officer with a reputation for discretion, he had once helped Lord Carrington with a private matter, years before his death. Though they hadn't been in contact since, Evelyn remembered him as someone who might understand the gravity of her situation without spreading gossip. She called him that afternoon. His voice was calm and measured on the phone, and after a brief conversation, they arranged to meet in person. Hawkins agreed to come to the estate the following morning under the guise of a casual visit. When Hawkins arrived, his appearance was just as she remembered. Tall, with a graying beard and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He greeted her politely, but there was a tension beneath his formal demeanor that set Evelyn on edge. They sat in the drawing room, the sunlight casting long shadows across the floor. Evelyn explained what she had uncovered about Mr. Hammond, her voice steady as she laid out the details of the conspiracy, the hidden documents, and the betrayal that had turned her world upside down. Hawkins listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When she finished, there was a long silence. Hawkins leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "This is quite a situation, Lady Carrington," he said finally. "But before we go any further, I need to ask you a question. Are you certain you can trust what you found?" The question caught Evelyn off guard. "What do you mean?" "I've been in this business a long time," Hawkins replied, his voice low. "And sometimes, things aren't as clear-cut as they seem. You're saying that Mr. Hammond has been involved in some sort of scheme, but is it possible that someone else planted those documents? That you're being led down this path for reasons?" Evelyn blinked, her mind racing. Could Hawkins be right? Was she being manipulated by someone other than Mr. Hammond? The thought hadn't even occurred to her. But now, with Hawkins sitting across from her, the idea seemed plausible. Had she been too quick to jump to conclusions? "I don't know," she admitted. "But everything I've seen, everything I've discovered, points to Mr. Hammond." Hawkins nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But if he's as clever as you say, it's possible he's setting someone else up to take the fall. Or worse, using you as a pawn in his own game." The room felt colder suddenly, the weight of Hawkins' words settling heavily on Evelyn's shoulders. She had been so focused on Mr. Hammond that she hadn't considered the larger picture. Could there be others involved? People even more dangerous than him? "I need more time," she said quietly. "More evidence." Hawkins leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Lady Carrington, I can help you, but you need to be careful. If you make the wrong move, if you confront the wrong person, this could all blow up in your face." Evelyn's pulse quickened. "What do you suggest?" Hawkins hesitated for a moment, then spoke carefully. "We need to tread lightly. I'll look into Mr. Hammond's background, see what I can find. But in the meantime, you need to continue acting as if you know nothing. Don't let on that you're aware of what he's been doing." Evelyn nodded, though her heart pounded in her chest. She had been playing this dangerous game for weeks, but now the stakes were higher than ever. If Hawkins was right, she wasn't just dealing with Mr. Hammond. There were others involved, and she needed to find out who they were before it was too late. As the days passed, Evelyn kept up her charade, carefully maintaining the appearance of a woman unaware of the machinations swirling around her. But beneath the surface, she was a coiled spring, waiting for the moment when she could strike. Detective Hawkins was working quietly, gathering information, but the lack of progress gnawed at her. Each day that passed felt like another opportunity for Mr. Hammond, or whoever was behind the conspiracy, to slip further out of reach. One evening, as Evelyn sat by the fire, she reflected on everything she had learned so far. The documents, the coded letters, the hidden offshore accounts. Each piece of the puzzle pointed to a much larger conspiracy than she had first imagined. But the more she thought about it, the more certain she became that Mr. Hammond wasn't acting alone. The clues were all there, but they weren't enough. She needed more, something that would tie Mr. Hammond directly to the others involved in the scheme. And if Hawkins' suspicions were correct, she needed to be careful not to tip her hand too soon. Her opportunity came a few nights later. Evelyn had been lying in bed, her thoughts swirling, when she heard the faint creak of floorboards outside her door. She lay still, listening, her pulse quickening as the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. Mr. Hammond. She rose silently from her bed and slipped to the door, peeking through the crack. Sure enough, there he was, moving with deliberate caution down the hall, heading toward the study. Evelyn's heart raced. Was this it? Was tonight the night she would finally catch him in the act? Without making a sound, she followed him, keeping to the shadows as he made his way to her late husband's study. Once there, he shut the door behind him, leaving Evelyn standing in the hallway, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She waited, listening, her ear pressed against the wood. There was the faint sound of rustling papers, the creak of a drawer being opened. Then, a voice, low and muffled. Evelyn's blood ran cold. He was talking to someone. But who? She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Mr. Hammond wasn't alone in this conspiracy. There was someone else, someone in the shadows, pulling the strings. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest as she listened, straining to hear more. But before she could catch another word, the door suddenly creaked open. She froze, stepping back just in time to avoid being seen as Mr. Hammond emerged from the study, his face expressionless. He walked back down the hall, disappearing into the darkness. Evelyn remained hidden, her mind racing. She had to know what he had been saying, who he had been talking to. Gathering her courage, she slipped into the study. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of old books and papers. She crossed to the desk, her hands trembling as she opened the drawer Mr. Hammond had been rummaging through. Inside was a single envelope. It was unmarked, but as Evelyn opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a letter, written in the same code she had found in the other documents. But this one was different. It wasn't just a financial record or a reference to offshore accounts. This letter was a direct message, addressed to H and signed by someone she didn't recognize. The contents were chilling. We're close. Keep her in the dark a little longer. When the time is right, we'll strike. Evelyn's hands shook as she read the words. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about her. They were targeting her. Mr. Hammond had been playing her for a fool, but now she had the proof she needed. There was a larger conspiracy at work, and it wasn't just about stealing from the Carrington estate. It was about destroying her. The knowledge that she was the target weighed heavily on Evelyn. For days, she could hardly focus on anything else. Every look from Mr. Hammond, every word from the staff, seemed laced with hidden meaning. Her once comfortable, orderly life had been torn apart by the realization that she was surrounded by people who wanted to see her fall. The letter she had found in the study had confirmed her worst fears. This wasn't just about money or the estate. It was personal. They were planning something, and she had no idea when or how they would strike. She felt like a prisoner in her own home, and the walls of Carrington Manor seemed to close in around her with every passing day. Hawkins' warning echoed in her mind. Tread carefully. If she acted too soon, she could ruin her chance to stop them. But the longer she waited, the more vulnerable she felt. Paranoia gnawed at her, and her nerves were frayed. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, and the constant fear was suffocating. Evelyn knew she had to make a decision. She could continue playing the part of the oblivious widow, waiting for Hawkins to uncover more, or she could confront Mr. Hammond directly. Every fiber of her being screamed for action, but she hesitated. What if Hawkins was right? What if she was being set up to fail? It was on a particularly cold, gloomy afternoon that Evelyn finally reached her breaking point. She had been sitting in the drawing room, staring blankly at the fire, when she heard the soft murmur of voices from the hallway. Mr. Hammond and Anna were talking quietly, but their conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed her nearby. Something about the way they exchanged glances, the tension in the air, made her blood run cold. They knew she was listening. They knew she was onto them. Evelyn's heart pounded as she stood up, her mind racing. This was it. She couldn't wait any longer. She had to confront Mr. Hammond before it was too late. Summoning every ounce of courage, Evelyn made her way to his quarters, her steps quick and determined. Her hands trembled as she knocked on the door, her throat dry with fear. "Come in," Mr. Hammond's voice called from inside, as smooth and calm as ever. Evelyn pushed the door open, her heart pounding. Mr. Hammond stood by the window, looking out over the gardens, his expression unreadable. He didn't turn to face her as she entered the room, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there before. "You wanted to see me, Lady Carrington?" he asked, his voice polite, but there was an edge to it. Evelyn swallowed, her voice shaky as she spoke. "I know what you've been doing, Mr. Hammond. I know about the letters, the meetings, the documents you've been hiding." For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, Mr. Hammond turned to face her, his expression calm, but his eyes cold. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." Evelyn's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Don't lie to me. I've seen the documents. I know you've been plotting against me, and I know I'm not the only one you're working with." Mr. Hammond's lips curled into a faint smile. "Lady Carrington, you've always had such an active imagination, but I assure you, I'm simply doing my job." The condescension in his voice made Evelyn's blood boil. "Your job? Spying on me? Stealing from me?" His smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. "It's not as simple as that." Evelyn took a step forward, her voice trembling with rage. "Then explain it to me." Mr. Hammond's expression darkened, the polite mask slipping just for a moment. "You wouldn't understand." Evelyn's pulse quickened. There it was, the crack in his facade she had been waiting for. "Try me," she said, her voice low and steady. For a moment, Mr. Hammond said nothing. Then he let out a soft sigh, as if he were tired of pretending. "It was never about you, Lady Carrington. Not at first. But then you started looking into things you shouldn't have, asking questions. And now, you've made yourself a target." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "What are you planning?" Mr. Hammond's smile returned, colder than ever. "You'll find out soon enough." Fear surged through her, but Evelyn stood her ground. "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," he replied quietly. The weight of his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Evelyn's heart raced, but she refused to back down. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let Mr. Hammond intimidate her. But as she stared into his cold, calculating eyes, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just dealing with a servant who had gone rogue. Mr. Hammond was part of something much bigger and much darker than she had ever imagined. Evelyn left Mr. Hammond's quarters with her heart pounding and her mind racing. The conversation had confirmed her worst fears. She was in danger, and it was coming from all sides. Mr. Hammond had shown his hand, but she still didn't know the full extent of his plan. Time was running out, and she needed to act. She couldn't wait for Hawkins any longer. The conspiracy had gone too far, and if she didn't take matters into her own hands, she might not survive to see the truth exposed. That night, as the staff retired to their quarters, Evelyn put her plan into motion. She had always known Carrington Manor better than anyone, and she would use that knowledge to her advantage. There was a secret passageway that ran from her bedroom to the library, one that even Mr. Hammond didn't know about. It had been built centuries ago, a hidden escape route in case of danger, and tonight, it would serve its purpose once again. Under the cover of darkness, Evelyn slipped through the passageway, her heart racing as she made her way to the library. She knew Mr. Hammond would be meeting someone there tonight. She had overheard his whispered conversation with Anna earlier in the day. If she could catch him in the act, with the evidence in hand, she could finally expose him. As she reached the end of the passageway, Evelyn paused, listening carefully. She could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from the library. Mr. Hammond wasn't alone. Her pulse quickened as she crouched behind the bookshelf, peering through the narrow crack in the door. There, standing in the center of the room, was Mr. Hammond, and with him was a figure Evelyn didn't recognize, a tall man dressed in dark, formal clothing. The two were speaking quietly, their voices low and tense. "I'm telling you we need to act soon," Mr. Hammond was saying, his voice sharp. "She's getting too close." The man beside him nodded. "And what about this state? Is everything in place?" "It will be," Mr. Hammond replied. "As long as we keep her distracted." Evelyn's heart raced. They were talking about her, about this state, about their plans to take everything from her. She clenched her fists, anger boiling in her chest. She had to stop them. But how? Suddenly, the man glanced toward the door, his eyes narrowing. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as he took a step forward, his hand reaching for the doorknob. Had he seen her? In a split second, Evelyn made her decision. She burst through the door, her heart pounding in her chest as she faced Mr. Hammond and the stranger. "This ends now," she said, her voice steady despite the terror racing through her veins. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Mr. Hammond stared at her, his expression unreadable. The man beside him narrowed his eyes. "You've made a mistake, Lady Carrington," Mr. Hammond said quietly, his voice calm but deadly. "You should have stayed in the dark." "I'm not afraid of you," Evelyn replied, her voice firm. "You should be," Mr. Hammond repeated, echoing his earlier words. Evelyn stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "I have evidence. Everything you've done, it's over." Mr. Hammond's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or fear. The man beside him shifted uncomfortably. "You think you can stop us?" Mr. Hammond asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're just one woman, alone." But Evelyn wasn't alone. As she took a step forward, the library doors swung open behind her, and Detective Hawkins stepped into the room, flanked by 2 police officers. "She's not alone," Hawkins said, his voice cold. For the first time, Mr. Hammond's composure cracked. He took a step back, his gaze darting between Evelyn and Hawkins. "It's over, Hammond," Hawkins said. "We know everything." Mr. Hammond's face twisted in rage, but before he could react, the officers moved forward, grabbing him by the arms. The stranger tried to flee, but Hawkins stopped him in his tracks, pulling him to the ground. Evelyn watched as Mr. Hammond was led away in handcuffs, his expression filled with venom. But it was over. The conspiracy had been exposed, and Carrington Manor was safe, for now. As the library fell silent, Evelyn let out a shaky breath. She had done it. She had uncovered the truth, and she had survived. But as she stood there, watching the police take the men away, she couldn't help but wonder, how deep had the conspiracy really gone? And who else had been involved? For now, at least, she had won. But she knew the battle wasn't over. The echo of footsteps faded as Mr. Hammond and his mysterious accomplice were led away from Carrington Manor. The tension that had filled the grand halls for weeks seemed to dissipate in an instant, but Evelyn knew the real weight of what had transpired would linger far longer. As she stood in the now quiet library, the reality of the situation hit her with full force. She had won, but at what cost? Detective Hawkins stayed behind to help her process the events. His calm, authoritative presence had been a saving grace, but even he couldn't shield her from the emotional fallout. As he approached, his face softened. "You did well, Lady Carrington," he said gently. "You were brave, and you handled yourself with remarkable strength." Evelyn nodded, but the exhaustion in her bones was overwhelming. She had been fighting for so long, fighting to protect her home, her life, her sanity, that now, in the aftermath, she didn't quite know how to feel. The truth was out, the conspiracy had been exposed, and Mr. Hammond was in custody. But the man she had trusted for years had turned out to be her greatest enemy. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hawkins looked at her with understanding. "This is the part people don't talk about," he said quietly. "After everything is over, after the dust settles, you're left with the pieces. But you're stronger than you think." Evelyn smiled faintly. She wasn't sure if she felt strong anymore. For so long, she had relied on her instincts, on the trust she placed in others. Mr. Hammond had been like family, and now that he was gone, she felt a strange emptiness. It wasn't just betrayal, it was grief for the life she had lost. As Hawkins walked her to the drawing room, Evelyn glanced around the manor. It felt different now, quieter, almost unfamiliar. The house, with its vast history and tradition, had always been a symbol of stability. But now, it felt like a reminder of all the lies that had been hidden within its walls. Sitting down in her favorite armchair by the fire, Evelyn finally allowed herself to breathe. For weeks, she had been living in a state of constant tension, always watching, always waiting. Now that the danger had passed, she felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. "I can't believe it's over," she murmured, more to herself than to Hawkins. Hawkins sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "It's not quite over," he said carefully. "There's still the matter of who else was involved. I don't believe Mr. Hammond was acting alone, and I suspect this conspiracy runs deeper than we initially thought." Evelyn looked at him sharply. "You mean there are others?" Hawkins nodded. "It's possible. The investigation is ongoing, and we'll be looking into any further connections. But for now, you can rest knowing that Mr. Hammond's part in this is finished." Evelyn's heart sank. She had thought this nightmare was behind her, but the detective's words reminded her that it might only be the beginning of a longer fight. She had exposed the truth, but the shadows that had crept into her life weren't gone. They had simply retreated, waiting for another opportunity to strike. "Will I ever be able to trust again?" she asked softly, her eyes distant. Hawkins gave her a sympathetic look. "That's something only time can answer. But trust is a fragile thing. You've been through more than most people ever will. It's natural to feel cautious." As they talked, Evelyn began to realize that her life would never return to the way it was before. She had changed. Carrington Manor had changed. The trust she had once placed so easily in others was shattered, and the thought of rebuilding it seemed impossible. But Hawkins was right about one thing. She was stronger than she had ever known. And though the road ahead was uncertain, she had faced the worst of it and survived. Days passed, and slowly, Carrington Manor began to return to some semblance of normalcy. The staff resumed their duties, though the atmosphere was still heavy with the knowledge of what had transpired. The shadow of Mr. Hammond's betrayal loomed large over the estate, and it would be a long time before the wounds fully healed. Evelyn, too, began to find her footing again. The initial shock and grief had given way to a quiet determination. She couldn't allow herself to be paralyzed by fear or doubt. The estate needed her, and she still had responsibilities to uphold. Slowly, she started reclaiming her life, one step at a time. She met with the remaining staff individually, assuring them that Carrington Manor would move forward despite the scandal. Though trust would be harder to rebuild, she couldn't afford to let her fears control her. The people who remained were loyal, and she knew she had to give them a chance to prove it. Anna, the housemaid, was especially shaken by the events. She had been caught in the crossfire of the conspiracy, and the guilt she felt for not speaking up sooner weighed heavily on her. One afternoon, as Anna was cleaning the drawing room, Evelyn called her over. "Anna," she began gently, "you've been through a lot. None of this is your fault." Anna looked down, her hands trembling as she twisted her apron. "I should have said something, milady. I should have warned you." Evelyn shook her head. "You did what you could. Mr. Hammond was very good at hiding his true intentions. We were all deceived." Anna looked up, her eyes filled with regret. "Thank you, milady. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself." Evelyn reached out, placing a comforting hand on Anna's shoulder. "What matters is that you helped me when it counted. We'll get through this together." The words seemed to comfort Anna, and for the first time since the confrontation, a small smile appeared on her face. Evelyn knew that rebuilding trust would take time, but moments like these reminded her that it was possible. As the days turned into weeks, Evelyn found herself growing stronger. She had weathered the storm, and though the scars of betrayal remained, she was determined not to let them define her. The investigation into Mr. Hammond's accomplices continued, and though the truth was still unraveling, she had faith that justice would be served. One evening, as Evelyn sat by the fire in the drawing room, she reflected on how much had changed. The house felt different now, quieter, but not in the suffocating way it had before. There was peace in the stillness, a sense of closure that she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in weeks, She allowed herself to relax. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the familiar warmth of the room wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. She had survived the worst of it, and though there were still challenges ahead, she knew she could face them. Carrington Manor would endure. She would endure. As she gazed into the flames, Evelyn realized that her life would never be the same, but perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. She had discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed, and though trust had been shattered, she was still standing. There was still a future for her here, at Carrington Manor. A future she would face on her own terms. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. It really helps us out. I'd love to hear from you. What part of a story had the most impact on you? Was it the suspense, the betrayal, or the final twist? Let me know in the comments below. Also, if you have any story ideas or suggestions for future videos, feel free to share them. Your input could inspire the next big story on this channel. Thanks for being part of the community. Let's keep creating great stories together.